You know, if you're tuning into this deep dive right now, there is a very good chance you're operating with this kind of low-grade hum of stress in the background.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's almost the default state for most
Uh,
people.
I mean, maybe you're gripping the steering wheel in traffic or, mentally prepping for a massive presentation, or maybe you're just trying to keep up with the totally relentless pace of modern life.
Yeah, that constant unyielding pressure.
Exactly. And you feel it in your shoulders, right? That tightness in your jaw. It's so common we barely even register it anymore.
We really don't. We just accept it.
But I want you to imagine for a second what that invisible stress is doing deep inside your body, specifically to your most delicate, fundamental biological systems.
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. Like, what if that tight feeling in your shoulders isn't just annoying, but is actually a chemical alarm system that is systematically shutting down your body's ability to reproduce?
It's a phenomenal question.
Yeah.
And frankly, we've essentially accepted this permanent state of high alert as our default setting.
Yeah.
But our biology, our cellular machinery, was absolutely not engineered to sustain that. And when it tries to, things start to break down.
Which is exactly what we are exploring today. We are going on a deep dive into the hidden biological collision between modern stress and human fertility.
It's a fascinating intersection of systems.
It really is. We're going to unpack the hard physical science behind how chronic stress effectively locks down the reproductive system. But we aren't just going to sit here and admire the problem.
Right, we need solutions.
Exactly. We are going to look at the override switch. We're exploring how an incredibly ancient practice, acupuncture, is being utilized right now alongside advanced modern medicine.
And doing so to physically rewire the nervous system, lower the alarms, and actually improve reproductive outcomes.
Yes. Okay, let's unpack this, because the intersection of neurobiology and traditional medicine here is just wild to me.
It is, and that's the crucial shift here. Today is really about moving past that vague, honestly infuriating advice of just relax.
Ugh. The worst advice.
Completely unhelpful, right? We need to understand the physical why behind the mind-body connection. To understand how stress dismantles fertility, we have to start by looking at a conflict between two major systems in the body.
Okay.
It's essentially a turf war between the HPA axis and the HPG axis.
Okay, whoa. HPA, HPG, that is an alphabet soup of medical jargon. Let's slow down and translate that for the listener.
Fair enough.
Because understanding this turf war is the key to everything else we're going to talk about today. Let's start with the HPA axis. What is that?
So the HPA axis stands for your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
Okay, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal.
Right. Think of it as your body's central fire alarm and emergency response system.
Got it. And the HPG axis.
That is the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. That system regulates all of your reproductive hormone signaling.
Right, which is obviously crucial for fertility.
Exactly. Now, human fertility is wildly complex. It is completely dependent upon perfect synchronized signaling between your brain, your endocrine system, and your reproductive organs.
It's a delicate dance.
It really is. So when you experience a threat, a stressor, your brain hits the panic button and the HPA axis fires up.
And the biological data maps out exactly how this chemical domino effect happens, right? Like, it all starts in the brain.
It does.
The hypothalamus senses danger and basically shoots off a distress flare. And that distress flare is a hormone called CRH.
That is the exact mechanism. CRH, which is corticotropin-releasing hormone, is the initial spark.
Okay.
That flare travels a tiny distance in the brain to the pituitary gland. The pituitary sees the flare and responds by releasing its own messenger, ACTH.
So it's passing the baton.
Exactly. That messenger enters your bloodstream, travels all the way down to your adrenal glands, which sit right on top of your kidneys,
Yeah.
and effectively yells at them to start pumping out cortisol.
Cortisol, the famous stress hormone.
The very one.
We hear about it all the time in wellness articles, but what is it actually doing in this specific context?
Here is where the turf war happens. Elevated cortisol is highly disruptive to the reproductive axis. Cortisol actively suppresses the pulsatility of GnRH. That's the hormone that tells the reproductive system to wake up and do its job.
Oh, wow. So it just mutes the signal.
Exactly. Because that signal is suppressed, your brain reduces its secretion of luteinizing hormone, or LH, and follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH.
Okay, let me try to visualize this, because it feels like the body is performing a massive energy diversion.
It is.
It's like a high-rise building running an emergency protocol. If the building is on fire, the building manager doesn't care about keeping the tenants comfortable.
Right. Comfort is irrelevant.
They shut off the Wi-Fi, they kill the air conditioning, and they route all available power to the fire alarms and the sprinkler systems.
That's a great way to look at it.
In the scenario, fight or flight is the fire alarm. The body is flooding itself with cortisol to survive the immediate threat. Reproduction is just the air conditioning. It's a non-essential background app.
Exactly.
The body just force quits the application to save power.
That is a brilliant analogy. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, human evolution, this acute stress response is actually a beautifully adaptive survival tool.
If you're running from a predator, yeah.
Right. If you are literally running from a bear, you do not need to be expending massive amounts of cellular energy on ovulating or producing sperm.
You just need to not get eaten.
Precisely.
Yeah.
You need all your blood and glucose routed to your muscles and your lungs. You just need to survive the next 10 minutes.
But there's the catch. Our modern stressors do not resolve in 10 minutes.
No, they don't.
A looming deadline at work, financial anxiety, or, the massive emotional weight of trying to conceive a child. These aren't predators that give up and go away. We're constantly running from a bear that lives in our inbox.
And that is where the biology actually turns against us. The acute, helpful stress becomes chronic, maladaptive stress.
Because the alarm never turns off.
Right. The brain leaves the fire alarms blaring indefinitely, which means it permanently cuts the hormonal funding to the reproductive organs. The clinical data shows this leads directly to reduced follicular development in women and severe insufficiency in the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle.
Which brings us to the actual physical wreckage this causes, because we need to be really clear here. We are not just talking about feeling emotionally anxious.
Not at all.
We are talking about tangible structural damage to both female and male fertility.
The physical toll is immense. Let's look at female fertility first. This stress-induced hormonal blackout contributes to an ovulation.
Meaning they stop ovulating entirely?
Exactly. The ovaries simply go on strike and stop releasing eggs, or the cycle becomes entirely unpredictable. The chronic stress also degrades the actual cellular quality of the eggs that are there.
That's terrifying.
It is. But perhaps the most critical physical impact, the one that really dictates whether a pregnancy can occur, involves the blood vessels.
Because stress activates the sympathetic nervous system. That's the fight or flight side of the dial, right?
Correct. And when the sympathetic nervous system is locked in the on position, it causes severe vasoconstriction.
Meaning the blood vessels physically tighten and narrow. I want you, the listener, to really picture that.
It's a powerful image.
Just imagine the blood vessels feeding the reproductive organs, just clamping down, choking off the flow.
You are creating an incredibly hostile, undernourished environment. Robust, free-flowing uterine blood flow is absolutely non-negotiable for an embryo to successfully implant and thrive.
So if there's no blood...
If the vessels are clamped shut from stress, the uterus is essentially starved of oxygen and nutrients.
And hold on, because here is where the data really flips a massive cultural stereotype on its head.
Oh, absolutely.
Historically, society has always framed fertility struggles, and
Right.
especially the emotional stress of trying to get pregnant, as a female issue. The whole just relax and you'll get pregnant trope. But the clinical data completely dismantles that. Here's where it gets really interesting. We have concrete research showing exactly what this chronic stress does to men, too.
It is a vital correction to make. The impact on male reproductive biology is just as profound, and it is highly measurable. It is not just a vague psychological issue.
Right. It's not just, oh, he's stressed at work, so his sex drive is lower.
No, the research points out that in males, chronic stress is directly linked to a significant drop in testosterone levels and a massive spike in oxidative stress.
And the detail that really stopped me in my tracks, elevated sperm DNA fragmentation?
Yes.
Think about that. The physical weight of stress is literally shattering the DNA inside the sperm.
It is a staggering level of cellular damage. When oxidative stress runs rampant in the body, it acts almost like rust on a car, breaking down the cellular structures.
So the sperm is structurally compromised.
Exactly. So if you take all of this, the ovaries failing to release eggs, the shattered sperm DNA, the clamped down blood vessels starving the uterus,
Yeah.
and you place it into the context of advanced medical treatments like IVF, you uncover a really dark reality.
You're talking about the paradox of assisted reproductive technologies.
I am.
The data shows that higher psychological stress levels are directly associated with lower pregnancy rates during these treatments.
Yes, the numbers don't lie.
And specifically, if a patient has elevated cortisol levels right at the moment an embryo is transferred into the uterus, the chances of that embryo successfully implanting just plummets.
This raises an important question, right? It's arguably the cruelest catch-22 in modern medicine. Think about what an IVF patient is enduring.
It's an overwhelming process.
They are investing thousands of dollars, months or years of their lives, and immense emotional hope into a highly invasive medical procedure. The procedure itself is traumatic and profoundly stressful.
So the very stress of the fertility treatment is triggering the cortisol dump,
Wow.
which clamps down the blood vessels, which actively prevents the treatment from working.
Precisely.
The patient is doing everything scientifically possible to get pregnant, but their autonomic nervous system is blaring the fire alarm and locking down the building.
The environment is entirely unreceptive because of the trauma of the process.
So how on earth do you fix that? If the brain is blaring the alarm and the body is locked down, how do you force the nervous system to hit the override button?
You have to intervene physically.
Because, as we established, looking at a patient who is thousands of dollars deep into IVS and telling them to just relax is infuriating. It probably spikes their cortisol even higher.
Telling someone to relax is biologically useless. You cannot think your way out of a neuroendocrine cascade.
Right.
You need an intervention that forces a physiological shift. You need to physically interrupt the nerve pathways. And this is where we turn to acupuncture.
And I have to be honest, this is the part of the deep dive where I naturally want to push back a little.
I'd expect nothing less.
Because culturally, we often bucket acupuncture into this, vaguely mystical spa day category. A lot of people might be thinking, okay, if I lie in a dark room with some soothing music and needles, maybe I feel a bit more relaxed. But isn't that just a placebo effect?
Sure.
Does it actually change the chemistry of the body?
It is a completely valid skepticism, but modern neuroendocrinology proves it is not a placebo. We are looking at hard empirical science here.
Okay.
Acupuncture exerts highly measurable physical effects on the central nervous system. Let's go back to that HPA axis, the fire alarm.
Right, the alarm system.
Clinical trials have definitively shown that targeted acupuncture significantly reduces circulating cortisol levels in the bloodstream.
How exactly? How does a tiny, hair-thin needle placed in the skin change the hormone output of an adrenal gland sitting all the way down on top of my kidney?
It comes down to strategically placed microtraumas. When an acupuncture needle is inserted, it stimulates specific nerve fibers in the muscle and skin.
Okay.
Those nerves send an immediate signal up the spinal cord directly to the brain. The brain receives this signal and responds by releasing a flood of beta endorphins.
Oh, so the body basically manufactures its own painkillers.
Yeah. Yes, but these beta endorphins do more than kill pain. They travel directly to the hypothalamus, the very brain region that sounded the alarm in the first place, and they physically bind to receptors there.
Wait, really? They just shut it down at the source?
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
They turn down the dial on the stress response. The distress flare is extinguished. And it goes beyond just beta endorphins.
What else is happening?
The data shows that acupuncture stimulates the release of a massive cocktail of neurotransmitters, including serotonin and dopamine.
The heavy hitters for emotional regulation and calm.
Exactly. You are literally chemically buffering the patient's brain against the trauma of the fertility treatment. But what's fascinating here is the most vital mechanism for reproduction. It's what happens to the autonomic nervous system.
Okay.
Remember that seesaw between the sympathetic fight, fight, or flight state and the parasympathetic rest and digest state?
Right. The stress had them permanently locked into fight or flight.
Acupuncture physically forces that seesaw to tip backward. It forcefully dials down the sympathetic nerve activity and heavily enhances the parasympathetic tone.
So what does this all mean? It really is like performing a hard reset on a glitchy Wi-Fi router.
I love that analogy.
The nervous system is stuck in this endless loop of high alert panic. You can't just ask the router nicely to start working again. You have to take a tiny pin, push it into that little hidden reset button on the back of the machine, and force the entire system to power down, clear its cache, and reboot back to a calm, functional baseline.
That is a flawless analogy for what is happening on a neuroendocrine level. We are mapping thousands of years of traditional Chinese medicine directly onto modern cellular biology.
It's incredible.
And when you perform that hard reboot, The downstream effects on fertility are incredible. Because you have shut down the cortisol alarm, the blockade on the reproductive hormones is lifted.
The system comes back online.
Yes, the pituitary gland can finally start secreting normal, healthy levels of LH and FSH again.
The building manager turns the air conditioning back on.
Exactly. The hormonal environment is finally hospitable to reproduction. Ovulatory function improves, and luteal phase stabilizes.
Okay, that is fascinating biology in a vacuum. I mean, I love understanding the neurotransmitter shifts, but if I am the listener, the ultimate question is, does this chemical reboot actually translate to more babies being born?
Naturally.
Does this work in the messy, high-stakes, real world of clinical medicine?
It absolutely does, and the clinical data is practically undeniable, especially when we look at the physical blood flow to the uterus.
Right. We established earlier that stress clamps down those blood vessels.
Well, landmark clinical studies took infertile women and used electroacupuncture, which is acupuncture with a very mild electrical current pulsing through the needles, and they mapped the blood flow.
And they found a massive reduction in the uterine artery pulsatility index.
Right. So the pulsatility index is essentially a medical measurement of resistance inside the blood vessels. High resistance means terrible blood flow.
To use another analogy, it is like a kinked garden hose. If the hose is tightly kinked, the water cannot reach the garden no matter how much you turn up the faucet.
It just builds up pressure.
Right. The chronic stress has kinked the uterine artery. The targeted electroacupuncture essentially unkinks the hose. It drops the resistance, which floods the uterine lining with rich, oxygenated, nutrient-dense blood, exactly when a developing embryo needs it the most.
And in the world of IVF, the timing of unkinking that hose is everything. This was brilliantly demonstrated in a major randomized controlled trial.
Oh, I read about this one.
Researchers took patients actively undergoing IVF embryo transfers. They didn't just give them acupuncture randomly. They administered it at incredibly specific windows.
When was it?
Immediately before the embryo transfer and immediately after.
And the outcome?
The group that received the targeted acupuncture had significantly higher pregnancy rates compared to the control group that didn't. It was not a marginal, maybe this helped difference. It was statistically significant.
That timing is incredible to think about, just before and just after the transfer. It is like they are using the needles to perfectly till and prime the soil and then immediately securing the environment once the seed is planted to ensure it isn't washed away by a stress response.
Exactly.
And I know from the data that this wasn't a fluke study. Massive meta-analyses looking at huge pools of patient data have confirmed this over and over. Acupuncture drastically improves clinical pregnancy rates and visibly reduces the crushing anxiety patients feel during an IVF cycle.
Which naturally leads to the question of application. Is this just academic theory, or are actual doctors utilizing this?
Right.
The reality is that this integrative approach is becoming highly formalized. There are specialized clinics dedicated entirely to bridging this gap. A prime example is the Berkley Center for Reproductive Wellness in New York City.
Right. Founded by Mike Berkley. The guy is a licensed acupuncturist and a fellow of the American Board of Oriental Reproductive Medicine.
He is.
He was actually one of the very first practitioners in the United States to dedicate an entire clinic exclusively to treating complex fertility challenges using this exact neurobiological methodology. He has been doing this for over 2 decades.
And what is particularly notable about a clinic like that is the severity of the cases they handle. They're not just running a wellness spa for people who want to relax.
No, they're dealing with the hard stuff.
They provide highly specialized care for patients navigating devastating diagnoses. Recurrent IVF failure, incredibly poor ovarian response, severe endometriosis, PCOS, recurrent pregnancy loss.
And crucially, male factor infertility.
Yes.
Which perfectly ties back to what we discussed earlier about shattered sperm DNA. This isn't just a female treatment.
Exactly. The Berkley Center represents the ultimate integration of medical philosophies. They use customized herbal medicine and targeted acupuncture protocols to fundamentally alter the physiological environment of the patient.
That's amazing.
If someone listening is actually navigating these profound challenges, this kind of integrative care is accessible. They operate out of New York City, and they can be reached at 212-685-0985 or online at berkleycenter.com.
I really appreciate having a tangible, real-world example of this because it completely shatters the tired debate of Eastern versus Western medicine. It is not a competition.
It really highlights the beauty of an integrative approach.
Yeah, it is a highly strategic partnership. You are using an incredibly targeted complementary therapy like acupuncture to unkink the hoses, reboot the router, and optimize the foundational physiology of the human body.
Absolutely.
You do that so the highly advanced, incredibly expensive reproductive technologies of Western medicine actually have a fighting chance to succeed. You are using the East to fix the hardware so the West software can actually run.
That is the perfect synthesis. We have to acknowledge the devastating biological impact of chronic stress, but we also have evidence-based tools to disarm that stress response at the deepest neuroendocrine level. It is entirely about creating systemic harmony in the body.
Which brings us right back to you, the listener. Whether you are currently in the trenches of the emotionally grueling journey of fertility treatments, or maybe you are just commuting to work right now, gripping the steering wheel and feeling that familiar tight hum of anxiety in your chest.
It's a lot to carry.
It is. I hope this deep dive feels deeply empowering, because the overarching message here is that our biology is not a runaway train.
The HPA axis might be a powerful survival mechanism, but it is not untouchable. You are
What?
not at its mercy.
Right. There are physical, highly evolved levers we can pull to regain equilibrium. We can unkink the hose. We can force the router to reboot. We can purposefully take our bodies out of that primal fight-or-flight mode.
We have the tools.
And it leaves me with this final, really provocative thought for you to chew on long after this deep dive ends. We have just spent the last 20-something minutes exploring how strategically placed microtrauma's tiny, hair-thin needles can profoundly alter the entire HPA axis and literally redirect systemic blood flow to our organs.
It's pretty wild to think about.
It really makes you wonder, if a tiny physical prompt can do all that, what other subconscious, hypervigilant survival mechanisms in our bodies are just sitting there, completely exhausted, simply waiting for us to give them the right signal to finally stand down?